Out in the far reaches of the western frontier, where the mountains watched like ancient gods and the wind carried whispers no man could name, there lived a woman taller than any man had ever seen. They called her the Giant Bride, not for beauty, nor for charm, but because she stood taller than a stallion and carried herself like a spirit carved from stone. Many men feared her. Others sought her hand out of arrogance or greed, thinking marriage to a legend would make them one. But she chose him, a lean, quiet ranch hand named Caleb who had never asked for greatness and wanted nothing but peace. When she offered herself to him, under the wide sky, with the whole village watching, he refused, not out of cruelty, not even out of fear. He simply said, "I don't belong beside someone like you." The crowd gasped. Laughter rippled like thunder. But she didn't blink. She didn't rage. She just nodded once and walked away, her footsteps shaking the dust from the earth. That night the wind died. The animals grew still, and something ancient began to stir beneath the ground, as if the world had been waiting for his answer all along. But Caleb couldn't sleep. Her eyes had stayed with him, not wounded, but knowing. There was something deeper there, something he didn't understand. So under moonlight, he followed the trail she had taken beyond the canyon ridge. What he found wasn't a woman scorned. It wasn't a bride rejected. It was something far older, far wilder. She stood before a wall of stone, hands raised, and as she spoke in a tongue long buried by time, the ground trembled. That night, the secret she revealed didn't just change Caleb's life. It changed everything he thought he knew about power, bloodlines, and the forces that still walk among men in the forgotten corners of the West. Because she wasn't just a bride. She wasn't just a giant. She was the last of something sacred, something feared, and something that had been waiting generations for a soul brave enough to say no and mean it. Stay close, because once you discover what she told him, what she showed him, you'll understand why the earth still quakes in that canyon, and why some names are better whispered than spoken aloud. Caleb had always lived life by the simple rules his father taught him. Speak only when needed, work harder than the next man, and never meddle in things that don't belong to you. So when the villagers pushed him toward the Giant Bride, nudging, winking, daring him, he had no interest in playing the fool. She stood a head taller than any man there, with shoulders like carved oak and eyes that didn't blink under heat or humiliation. Most men saw her size and thought of conquest. Caleb saw something else. Grief. When he declined her offer in front of the whole town, he hadn't meant disrespect. His voice was soft, measured, even apologetic. "You deserve someone stronger," he'd said. But her gaze told him she'd heard something different. Not rejection, not insult, but truth. The kind no one ever dared to tell her face to face. She turned, said nothing, and walked away with the grace of someone carrying more than just her own weight. And the crowd, who had once laughed, fell quiet. That night, the desert sky was unusually still. No coyotes howled. No wind rattled the windows. Caleb lay awake on his cot, staring at the cracked ceiling of his shack. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Not her height, but her silence. There had been something haunting in the way she left. Not shame, not sorrow, something older. And then he heard it, a deep, rhythmic vibration under the floorboards. So faint he almost thought it was in his chest. The ground was breathing. Drawn by a pull he couldn't explain, Caleb saddled his mule and followed the path out past the ridgeline, beyond where even the wild horses roamed. He saw her silhouette long before he reached her, tall, unmoving, cloaked by moonlight, standing before a jagged wall of red stone that locals whispered was cursed. As he approached, she didn't turn. Instead, she placed her palm on the rock and began to speak. Not to him, but to the mountain itself. Her voice was unlike anything he'd ever heard. Low, layered, not quite human. It echoed, not across the canyon, but through it. And then, with a sound like thunder underwater, a crack split the stone in two, revealing a glowing chamber beneath the earth. Caleb froze. She finally turned to him and said calmly, "You were right to refuse me. But now you have to see why I asked." He stepped forward, not out of bravery, but because something in the ground, in the air, in him, had already decided this night would change everything. Inside the chamber, the walls pulsed with warmth. Symbols carved centuries ago flickered with soft light, shifting as they breathed. Caleb walked slowly, careful not to speak, afraid a single word would shatter the impossible silence surrounding them. The giant bride moved with familiarity, as though she had returned to a home she hadn't seen since girlhood. She lit no torch, yet the path ahead of her glowed. Every step she took felt preordained. She led him to the center of the cavern, where a pool of water rested still as glass. Suspended above it, without support, was a stone tablet, spinning slowly, etched with markings neither of them could read aloud. "This," she whispered, "is what they buried me to protect." Caleb didn't dare ask who they were, or what this truly meant. The ache in her voice was enough to silence any doubt. She reached into the water and pulled from a medallion shaped like an eye, its pupil glowing gold. "I'm the last daughter of the Hollow Mother," she said. "And you are the first man to listen without fear." Caleb felt the ground tilt beneath him, not from motion, but revelation. He didn't know the Hollow Mother, but the name struck something in his bones, like a song half remembered. She handed him the medallion. The second his fingers touched it, visions slammed into him. Battles waged with sound, cities lost to storms, warriors bound to the earth through sacred oaths older than history. And in each of those visions, a towering woman stood between worlds, guardian, bride, destroyer, healer. He dropped the medallion, gasping. She caught it before it hit the ground. "You see now," she said, "they call me a bride to mock me, to reduce me. But I was never meant to be anyone's wife. I was meant to choose someone who could carry the truth when I was gone." Caleb's knees buckled. "Why me?" he managed to whisper. She smiled, for the first time, not with joy, but with recognition. "Because you didn't see me as power. You saw me as pain." Behind them, the chamber walls began to hum, a warning that time was short. She turned and walked to the far side, where a stone staircase twisted downward into darkness. "If you walk with me now," she said, "you leave behind everything you knew, your name, your land, your peace. But you'll learn what was hidden. And if you survive, the earth itself will call you son." Caleb looked at the path behind him, the starlight barely visible from the cave's mouth. Then he turned back, took one breath, and followed her into the dark. The staircase was unlike anything Caleb had ever descended. Each step felt alive beneath his boots, like walking down the spine of some great beast resting beneath the land. The air thickened, not with dust, but with something ancient, something awake. As they moved deeper, the glow from the medallion, she carried illuminated murals carved into the walls. Scenes of towering women defending villages from floods, parting sandstorms with their bare hands, healing the sick with a whisper. It was a history erased from every book he'd ever known. The giant bride, no longer a myth, no longer a mystery, spoke softly as they walked. She told him of the Hollow Mothers, once revered as the Earth's chosen daughters. They were born once, every generation, towering not just in size but in spirit, guardians of balance between man and nature. But over time, as men claimed more land and erased more truths, the Hollow Mothers were hunted, branded witches, monsters, abominations, until only one remained. "I was hidden as a child," she said, raised in silence, taught to forget the words that once moved mountains. Her voice cracked, but she kept walking. "They told me love would weaken me, that choosing a man would betray my duty. But I've watched this world grow loud with pride and deaf to wisdom. And then you." She turned to him, her face softer now. "You refused me, not to shame me, but because you saw more than power. You saw a person." Caleb's chest tightened. Every word she spoke unraveled another lie he'd been raised to believe. That strength meant dominance. That silence meant ignorance. That a woman like her needed taming. But in this place, beneath the roots of the earth, all of that fell away. She was more than strength. She was legacy. And what she had guarded all this time was more than magic. It was truth. Truth the world above had buried in fear. They reached the final step. Before them stood a vast underground chamber, shaped like a heart, pulsing with a soft red light. In its center stood a stone pillar, cracked, trembling, and barely holding back a deep fissure that glowed like molten fire. "This," she said, "is the earth's wound, and every lie spoken above makes it bleed." Caleb stepped closer, heart pounding. He understood now. The burden wasn't just hers. It was his too. The chamber's heat didn't burn, it revealed. Caleb felt the weight of his own lineage pressing down on him. He saw visions not from her memory, but from his own bloodline. Ancestors who had once walked with the Hollow Mothers, made pacts with them, stood shoulder to shoulder before greed turned their backs. Somewhere in his past, a vow had been broken, and now, here he stood, at the edge of the consequence. The giant bride knelt beside the pillar, placing the medallion into a carved socket at its base. The entire chamber shifted, stone grinding against stone, a low moan echoing like thunder through a canyon. The crack began to seal, but only partially. "It needs two," she said. "One to remember, and one to carry forward." She looked up at Caleb, her eyes not pleading, but inviting. "Will you hold what they erased?" Caleb approached, knees trembling. He reached out and laid his palm beside hers. The pillar pulsed. Light surged up his arm, through his chest, into his skull. He saw everything. The rise of the Hollow Mothers, the betrayal, the silence that followed, and then her birth, her hiding, her loneliness, her strength, her sorrow. It was not a story, it was a song, and he was now part of its melody. The chamber fell still. The glow faded. The wound had closed for now, but the memory remained in him, carved deeper than any scar. When he opened his eyes, she was watching him, not with reverence, not with gratitude, but with equality. "You know now," she said. "The truth lives in you. You'll walk among them again, but you won't be like them anymore." Caleb nodded, his voice gone, his soul changed. The way back would not be easy, but he carried more than knowledge. He carried her trust, her burden, and the earth's last warning. Together, they ascended the steps, not as legend and man, but as two remnants of a forgotten covenant. And though the world above waited with questions and doubt, neither looked back. Because once you've touched the truth buried beneath centuries of silence, you don't return the same. You become the echo. When they emerged from the cavern, dawn was beginning to stretch across the desert horizon. But the sun looked different to Caleb now. Less like warmth, more like a spotlight exposing everything the world had chosen to forget. The wind brushed his face, carrying the same silence he'd felt below, but now it whispered with him, not against him. The giant bride, no, the hollow daughter, stood beside him, her shoulders no longer bowed beneath the weight of secrecy. She had passed the burden. Now, they would share it. They walked back, toward the village in silence. But it wasn't the same silence that had once cloaked Caleb's life in solitude. It was full, alive. Every rock, every tree, every grain of sand seemed to see him now. And when they reached the edge of the settlement, something even stranger happened. The people, who had once mocked her and feared her, stepped aside, not with scorn or suspicion, but with awe. They didn't know what had changed. They only knew something had. Caleb's friends looked at him differently, not with admiration, with confusion. "You were gone a night," one man whispered, "but your eyes look older." Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. How could he explain that beneath their feet, a wound had been sealed with ancient truth? How could he tell them that the woman they feared was the last shield between them and the earth's wrath? Some truths weren't meant to be shouted. They had to be felt. The giant bride didn't speak either. She walked straight to the village well and sat beside it, eyes scanning the hills. She knew something Caleb was only starting to grasp, that the wound below may have sealed, but above, the world would test that seal. Greed would return. Pride would poke at old scars. And when that happened, the people would need someone who remembered the cost of silence. Someone who refused not out of fear, but out of respect. And so, Caleb stayed. He didn't leave for the ranch or the hills or the open road like he once dreamed. He stayed beside her, learning, listening. And slowly, others joined. The children first, drawn by curiosity. Then the elders, drawn by memory. And though no one spoke of the cavern, they began to speak with more care. They listened when the wind changed. They planted with intention, because somehow they felt the earth watching again, and that, more than any speech or miracle, meant the Hollow Mother's legacy had awakened once more. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of village life resumed, but it carried a new tone, quieter, more reverent. People began to notice subtle shifts. Water from the well ran clearer, crops sprouted earlier, and the horses grew calmer, as if the land itself had taken a breath and begun to heal. They didn't know the source of these changes, but Caleb and the hollow daughter did. It was not magic. It was memory honored, balance restored, even if only for a time. The elders, who once sat in silence as the younger men mocked the giant bride, now found themselves watching her with quiet respect. They'd heard stories in their childhood, tales of the tall women who spoke with the soil and called down rain with their hands. They had dismissed them as bedtime myths. But now, seeing her walk through the village, her presence like wind before a storm, they began to wonder if they had been wrong to forget. Or worse, if they had been taught to forget. Caleb had changed too, not just in posture or in how he carried his tools, but in the way he listened. He no longer interrupted the wind. He waited, watched. Every morning, he walked the edge of the canyon where the stone had split and sealed again, laying one hand on the earth, feeling for tremors not of violence, but of warning. He had become the bridge she spoke of, the one who could walk among men without betraying the truth beneath their feet. And the children? They began to sit near her at dusk, at first hesitantly, then with joy. She taught them old games their ancestors had buried with shame, games that taught patience, balance, rhythm. When one boy asked if she was magic, she smiled and said, "No, I'm what magic fears." Caleb watched as her laughter, once hidden beneath years of solitude, slowly returned. And it rang through the village like the first rain after a long drought. But not all watched with peace. A few outsiders had begun to ride past more often, men with government maps, sharp suits, and colder eyes. They asked about land ownership, mineral rights, surveys. They took notes when the villagers spoke of the crops and the water. They didn't speak to her. They barely looked at her. But Caleb saw it in their glances. They felt threatened, not by a woman, not by myths, but by something they couldn't measure or control. And that, he knew, meant the earth's wound might yet be torn open again. The outsiders returned a second time, this time with uniforms and polished boots. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They walked the land like they owned it, hands folded behind their backs, eyes calculating. One of them, a man with silver in his beard and no dust on his coat, stood in the center of the village and read a decree. The land had been purchased by Eastern investors. The villagers were to vacate within 30 days. No room for negotiation. No space for memory. The people were stunned. No one had signed anything. No one had agreed. But papers don't need consent when signatures are forged and officials are paid. The village, once slow-moving and full of quiet, suddenly buzzed with fear. What would they do? Where would they go? Caleb listened, jaw clenched, but he didn't panic. He turned to her, and she was already standing, taller than the soldiers, taller than the panic, taller than the lies. That night, she brought Caleb to the canyon again, to the place where the earth once trembled beneath her voice. "They'll take the land," she said, "but they cannot take the root." She knelt and drew a symbol in the sand, one Caleb had seen before, carved into the chamber wall. "It's time to awaken the others." He didn't understand. "What others?" he asked. She looked up, eyes burning with something ancient. The daughters who were never buried. The ones who still listened to the soil. Together, they rode for days. Through ravines, along dry riverbeds, to places no map dared mark. And in hidden pockets of the frontier, they found them, women tall and silent, veiled in dust, watching the world from the shadows. Some had gone years without speaking. Others lived among animals. But when she arrived, they rose, one by one, as if they'd been waiting for her voice to echo through the mountains once more. By the time they returned to the village, there were 7 of them, 7 hollow daughters, walking side by side. The villagers watched in silence. The outsiders stared, unsure whether to laugh or flee. And Caleb stood among them, no longer a man lost in dust, but a man carrying thunder in his chest. Because something was coming. Not a war, not a battle. Something older, something the earth had buried and was now ready to awaken. The next morning, the outsiders returned with wagons, armed men, and a preacher from the city who claimed to speak in the name of progress. He talked about railroads, about jobs, about the future. He called the village a relic. He called the people naive. But when his eyes met the line of hollow daughters standing behind Caleb, His voice faltered, because they didn't look like relics. They looked like judgment wearing flesh. The preacher tried again. He mocked their silence, accused them of superstition. "This land needs order," he said. "Not ghost stories." But as he spoke, the sky darkened, not with clouds, but with dust rising from the edges of the hills. The wind shifted. The air grew heavy. Animals fled without sound. And then, beneath their feet, the ground rumbled, not violently, but with a steady, ancient rhythm, like a drum that hadn't been beaten in 1,000 years. One of the Hollow Daughters stepped forward, an elder with white hair braided down her waist. She didn't speak to the preacher. She spoke to the earth. She knelt, placed her palm on the soil, and whispered something in a language no man remembered. The land responded. A crack opened behind her, just wide enough to show molten light beneath. Not a threat, a reminder. The preacher dropped his Bible. One of the armed men fell to his knees. The villagers didn't run. They stood still, calm. They had seen this before, felt it. They knew the difference between violence and warning. Caleb stepped beside the Hollow Daughter and finally spoke. "This land doesn't belong to men who bought it with lies. It belongs to the ones who remember it." His voice carried not with rage, but with certainty. And in that certainty, the outsiders saw, not superstition, not legend, truth. By sunset, they were gone. Wagons turned, orders withdrawn, not by force, but by fear of something they couldn't fight. Not a bullet, not a sword, but a legacy they couldn't erase. Caleb watched them disappear into the horizon, then turned to her, his guide, his witness, the one they once mocked as a bride. She nodded, not in triumph, but in peace. Because for the first time in generations, the earth had been heard, and the world had listened. Peace returned, but not the same kind they had known before. It was deeper now, rooted in something sacred that pulsed through the land like blood beneath skin. The Hollow Daughters didn't vanish back into hiding. They stayed, not as rulers, not as warriors, but as reminders. They helped rebuild the gardens. They taught the children how to read the wind, how to plant with intention, how to honor what lies below. And Caleb, once just a quiet ranch hand, became a keeper of memory, a man between worlds, speaking for both silence and truth. The village changed, slowly and surely. People began to walk with more care, to speak with more weight. They built homes using old designs, circular, open to the sky, in harmony with the sun and the stars. No one claimed leadership. No one tried to own the land. It was shared, watched over, respected. The canyon was no longer feared. It became a place of initiation, where young ones were brought to hear the stories carved into the stone, stories not of war, but of awakening. One day, the giant bride, now simply called the first daughter, stood beside Caleb as they overlooked the canyon's edge. She had grown quieter with time, not from weariness, but from fulfillment. "You changed the story," she said. Caleb shook his head. "You were the story," he replied. But she smiled, eyes distant. "No, I was the beginning. You were the one who refused a lie. That's what broke the curse. That's what made the earth listen again." Caleb thought often about that night, the moment he refused her, the moment the earth stirred. He realized it hadn't been about pride or rebellion. It had been about seeing her truthfully, not as a bride, not as a legend, but as a soul. And in that single moment of clarity, everything had shifted. The Hollow Daughters hadn't needed saviors. They had needed witnesses, someone willing to see them fully, and to remember what the world tried so hard to forget. Years later, travelers passing through would whisper about a village where the land hummed beneath your feet, where tall women walked with fire in their gaze, and where the wind sometimes spoke if you stood still long enough. Most didn't believe the tales, but the wise ones, the ones who listened, they said it was true. That once, a man refused a giant bride, and the earth, wounded and waiting, finally healed. Time moved on, as it always does, but some things never faded. Caleb's hair turned white, his hands rough with age, but his eyes never lost that quiet fire. He spent his final years teaching, not from books, but from memory. He taught that strength wasn't loud, that truth didn't need permission, that the most powerful word a man could ever speak was no, when it came from reverence, not ego. The first daughter remained beside him through all. Not as wife, not as queen, but as sister of the land, eternal witness of balance. They often sat in silence at dusk, watching the sun drop into the canyon. "It's still breathing," she would whisper, hand pressed to the earth. And Caleb, even in old age, could feel it too, the steady, ancient pulse of something vast and sacred, no longer hidden, no longer angry, just awake. When Caleb's final breath came, it was beneath the same sky that once watched him refuse her. The villagers laid him to rest near the canyon's edge, beneath a tree that had grown without seed. A gift, they said, from the Hollow Mother herself. No stone marked his grave, only a single line, carved into the tree's bark by her hand. He remembered. The Hollow daughters stayed a while longer, until they felt the land could stand on its own again. Then they vanished, as quietly as they had come. Some say they returned to the mountains. Others believe they walked the desert still, watching, waiting, listening for another who sees the soul before the story. But their legacy remained, in the hands of the children, in the silence of the canyon, in the wind that now moved with grace, not warning. And so the story lives, not in history books, not in songs, but in the land itself, in the cracks of a stone, the rhythm of the dust, the hush before a storm. Because once, a man refused a bride too powerful for any altar, and instead chose to walk beside her. And in doing so, he gave voice to the earth, and the earth never forgot. In a land where pride was currency and power was often misunderstood, one man's refusal became the key that unlocked an ancient truth. Caleb didn't change the world with a sword or a shout, but with silence, respect, and the courage to say no when the world expected him to say yes. His choice revealed something buried not just beneath the ground, but within all of us. The idea that strength is not in control, but in understanding. That seeing someone fully, without fear, judgment, or expectation, can awaken forces deeper than time itself. The giant bride was never meant to be conquered, nor pitted. She was a mirror held up to the world's arrogance, a reminder of everything forgotten in the pursuit of domination. And when Caleb looked at her and saw not a challenge, but a soul, he did something rare. He broke the cycle. He didn't follow the path carved by generations before him. He walked beside it, and in doing so, helped shape a new one grounded in balance, in memory, in truth. This story is more than legend. It's a reminder that every day we're given choices, to listen instead of speak, to honor instead of assume, to witness instead of judge. And perhaps the most powerful choice of all is to walk away from what the world tells you to want and walk toward what the soul quietly knows is right. Caleb chose reverence. He chose humility. And because of that, the earth, so long silenced, answered back. Let this tale settle into you. Let echo. Because somewhere in the quiet corners of your own life, there may be a moment, small, unassuming, when everything depends on how you see someone, whether you label them or listen to them. And in that moment, you too may find that what shakes the earth isn't always thunder. It's a single act of grace, given in silence, and remembered forever. If this story moved something within you, if it stirred questions, emotions, or memories, stay close. Subscribe to this channel so these truths of the old world can keep breathing in the new one. Like the video if it resonated, and share your thoughts below. What would you have done? Because when stories are shared, they don't end, they take root. Just like the one that grew beside Caleb's final resting place.